The Keeper is a really unique case in the sense that it really came out of my exploration of screenwriting. For the past, well, really for the past 20 some years, but more so the last 5 or 6 years, I have really been working a lot more in screenwriting. I've sold pilots. Steve and I co-wrote an episode of The Twilight Zone for Jordan Peele. We both would love to get a movie made. That's one of these big dreams we have that we have not been able to fulfill yet. And The Keeper came out of that process where I literally said, instead of only writing scripts when producers come to me wanting to adapt something from prose, I need to write more original scripts. And The Keeper was my first original script. I mean, we wrote it together. I mean, the idea came from me, but Steve was right there, keeping me honest in terms of the history of the creature and making sure that it made internal sense and that kind of thing. Because, sometimes in monster stories, you just want to say, because I say so. That's why that happened. But there were reasons for everything to happen. And we never were able to get it set up. We came very close to getting it set up, and we were never able to get it set up. So thank goodness that we had sent the treatment to John Jennings, an editor over at Megascope Abrams Comic Arts, and he said immediately, "Oh, this would make a great graphic novel." So I had a little bit of a heartache. I was licking my wounds from the Hollywood experience, but yes, then another opportunity appeared, and Marco Finnegan just fell into that script and immediately started sketching it to life. I think even before we had finalized the contract, he just did such a great job of creating really what would be storyboards, for a great film, but it happens to be a graphic novel that readers can enjoy in that current form. And that's a luxury that most screenwriters never have. I mean, you can be a screenwriter and have 30 scripts sitting in your drawer that no one will ever see because that's screenwriting. And I really encourage screenwriters, especially because comics are so big right now, don't accept the end of the line. That's not the end of the line just because some executive said no. Is there another form in which this could live? Could it be a graphic novel, which I think would be the easiest transition for a lot of screenwriters, because you're just writing another version of a script, or even a novel if you want to be a little more daring. But yeah, that doesn't have to be the end of the line because an executive said no. The Reformatory is coming out in October. Whew, that's a big one. That's like a whole conversation unto itself. But I will say that shortly after my mother passed away in 2012, she passed away in December of 2012. In early 2013, I heard from the Florida State Attorney General's office, not my favorite office, but in this case, what they were contacting me about was that I have a great uncle named Robert Stevens who died while he was at the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida in 1937. I had never heard of the Dozier School, but I quickly, did some research and learned that a lot of survivors' families had gotten the place shut down and were pushing. The reason the office called was to get permission to exhume remains. There were other family members they eventually reached as well, but they found me. My mother was Patricia Stevens' dude. This was her uncle who died there, but I don't think she even knew about him. When they called, I thought they were calling about a different juvenile execution from her mother's side of the family, which is another story. But no, this was about the father's side of the family. And I went to Marianna with my father, John Dew, and my husband, Steve, and our son, Jason, and we took part in the opening of the exhumation. Jason even got to sift through some of the soil, and we thought he would want to leave. He was about 9. We had planned a day of activities for him, but he didn't want to leave. He was so fascinated by the story. And I interviewed survivors both at that site in Marianna, and also I found others through research and internet. But I realized early on I wanted to write about it, but I didn't want to write nonfiction for the aforementioned reason, but also it didn't feel like my story in nonfiction. The memoirs that have come out about Dozier are much, much closer. People who literally were survivors themselves, or one woman wrote about her father's experience there. I didn't know Robert Stevens. I actually, no one I talked to ever knew Robert Stevens. Even an uncle I apparently have who is named after him, Robert Stevens, did not know that he was named after this Robert Stevens. So I filled in the rest with fiction. And rather than setting it in the 30s, which is an era I don't really know well, it's not covering my turn of the century Madam C.J. Walker era, and it's not covering my Freedom in the Family era. So I chose the 50s because I know that era much better from my mother. That was the time of her youth, and that was where a lot of her stories originated. So I named the character Robert Stevens to honor the young man who died at Dozier. But the story itself is a fictionalization. It's a ghost story to make it more accessible for readers so that you're not just slogging through a horrible incarceration story. There's like ghostiness to keep it ironically lighter than reality, but also to pay homage to the suffering that happened there, because every ghost represents a real person who died, not a real person, but every ghost represents someone who died at that reformatory. And it's kind of a microcosm of everything that's wrong with our criminal justice system, and especially our juvenile justice system. But you can see the relationship that the town, it's a for-profit, basically, prison, and it runs the printing press and the cornfields, and they're using slave labor from children. And, there are a lot of corollaries between what's happening in actual so-called criminal justice today and what happens in the reformatory in 1950. So it has sort of that sense of mission that I felt when I was writing Blood Colony and Joplin's Ghost, but it's about child imprisonment. I really think for a lot of horror in particular, whether it's ghosts or demons or whatever the particular subgenre, you start with the characters. That was the lesson that I learned from Stephen King as a reader, as a young person. And even though I do love horror, I still feel like there are a lot of Stephen King readers who don't really love horror. They don't read any other horror writers. They just love Stephen King. And I think that's because he does such a great job of creating characters and scenarios where you have no choice but to believe it. So if I believe this is a real mother and son, I will read hundreds and hundreds of pages about a dog barking outside of their car, which is the plot of Cujo. Okay, because it's the characters. And that dog is as scary to the reader as it is to the characters. So I think the most concrete advice I would give is not just that you have to create full and psychologically realistic characters, but they must feel imperiled. Because if they're not scared, your reader will not be scared. I mean, they can walk through a gauntlet, but if they're feeling fearless and they're not nervous and they're not jumping, then your reader is not going to be nervous and jumping either. Or at least that's my thought. For writing horror in particular, it's not just that the scenario has to be scary, but that someone experiencing it also has to find it scary. And writing close point of view, not first person necessarily, but close third person point of view is the most effective way to create a character to carry a reader through a scary scenario. Close third person point of view. Third person is he said, she said, she saw, he saw. But close means that rather than it's like floating above the character, almost semi-omniscient, like the narrator is discussing things that are around the corner that the character can't see, you're very much behind the character's eyes. We're only experiencing what that character is experiencing for the most part. I mean, sometimes I would be cute, like at the end of the chapter, and say, but little did they know that the party would soon be over. It's like, oh, what's the bum, 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 bum. I mean, that is not from the character's point of view, that's narrator. But I mean, it's fine to insert that from time to time, but for the most part, you want to walk through and you can have multiple points of view. I think it's interesting if one character is having one experience and another character is having a different experience, like in The Good House. So when an editor comes to me and says, write me a short story, and I have a quick deadline and I have not a clue what I'm going to write about, this is how I find a story quickly now, which is something I haven't been able to do so much in the past. First of all, usually it's just some sort of scary premise might present itself. Joplin's Ghost is a good example. What if the Joplin house is haunted? Okay, that's a premise, but that's not a story. That's just going to get you started. But you need to have what is the real life trauma or transgression that is going to open the door to that horror? So in something like The Shining, it would be alcoholism and child abuse. That's the real life transgression that opens the door to horror. The fake horror is that this is a haunted hotel, right? That's not real. That's the entertaining part of the story, but it's rooted in something that's real, which is child abuse and alcoholism. And if you look at your favorite horror stories, you can almost always find what that real life trauma or transgression is that is opening the door to the supernatural. And then, as Steve said, and it's not necessarily in this order, for what character is this the perfect scenario for them to experience horror? So I have an upcoming story in my new collection, The Wishing Pool and Other Stories, which is coming out April 18th, I think, that I had to write quickly. And it's a long one. It's more like a novelette. And I had meant to write about a fungus that I saw growing that was gross. It just grew out of nowhere and it was gross. And it's like, oh, I should put that in a story, but it's just a fungus. I mean, it's not a story. There's nothing else to it. So I had to figure out where would it be the scariest for this fungus to be? What might this fungus be representing? What is the real life transgression? In this case, it's a mother who has lost custody of her daughter because accidentally she broke her daughter's arm. And so that's the real life transgression, is child abuse or perceived child abuse. And part of the story is, was it child abuse? Was it not child abuse? That's part of what the reader and the character have to come to terms with. But the supernatural element is that there is a haunting. And the reasons why, it's always fun to ask why there would be a haunting. Hauntings don't just pop up for no reason. Okay, hauntings usually represent something terrible that is a secret that just wants to be aired. And that's why I would much rather end up in a ghost story than in a demon story, because usually ghosts just want their story told. I'm good with that. I will recognize you and tell your story. Demons, who knows what they want? And they could be writing you for generations. There's no pleasing a demon. So I would much rather encounter a ghost, but it's still scary. It's still scary when things are appearing out of nowhere and things are moving around. But that's basically my template is, what is the real life transgression or trauma? What is the supernatural manifestation in the story or a subgenre of horror that this story represents? And who is the best character to interact with this premise? Who will get the most scares out of it and who stands to gain the most out of it?